The year was 480 BCE, and the city-state of Sparta was abuzz with tension. King Leonidas, a seasoned warrior and leader, paced the halls of his palace, his mind consumed by the growing threat of the Persian Empire. Xerxes, the great king of Persia, had been assembling a massive army, intent on conquering Greece and adding it to his vast dominion. As Leonidas gazed out the window, he watched the sun set over the Taygetus Mountains, casting a golden glow over the city. He knew that Sparta's independence was at stake, and the time for action was drawing near. The whispers of war had been circulating for months, and Leonidas had made up his mind to stand against the Persian tide. He summoned his council of elders, a group of wise and experienced men, to discuss the impending threat. The room was heavy with the scent of olive oil and smoke, as the elders gathered around the central hearth. "Brothers, the time has come to act," Leonidas declared, his voice firm and resolute. "Xerxes will not stop until he has crushed us all. We must stand together, as Greeks, and defend our land." The elders nodded in agreement, their faces etched with concern. One of them, a grizzled veteran named Cleomenes, spoke up. "Sparta will not back down, Leonidas. We will stand with you, but we must also consider the other city-states. Athens, Corinth, Thebes. We need their help if we are to defeat the Persians." Leonidas nodded, his eyes gleaming with determination. "I've already sent messengers to our allies, requesting their aid. But I fear that some may not be willing to join us. We must be prepared to face the Persians alone, if need be." As the council deliberated, a young warrior, Dionysus, burst into the room, his face flushed with excitement. "King Leonidas, a messenger has arrived from the oracle of Delphi. He brings news from the gods themselves." The room fell silent, as the messenger, a hooded figure, stepped forward and revealed the oracle's words. "If you wish to save your city, O king, you must sacrifice yourself and your men. For on this day, the gods decree that either Sparta will fall or a Spartan king must die." Leonidas's eyes locked onto the messenger, his expression unyielding. He knew that the oracle's words were a call to action, a summons to defend Greece against the Persian hordes. "I will lead the way," he declared, his voice steady. "I will take 300 of our finest warriors, and we will march to Thermopylae to hold the pass against the Persians. We will show Xerxes that Sparta will not be intimidated." The council erupted into a mixture of cheers and worried murmurs, as Leonidas stood tall, his heart pounding with anticipation. The gathering storm was about to unleash its fury upon Greece, and King Leonidas was ready to face it head-on. The sun had barely risen over the Spartan countryside when King Leonidas and his 300 hand-picked warriors set out on their fateful journey to Thermopylae. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew-kissed grass and the distant tang of the Eurotas River. As they marched, the rhythmic thud of their footsteps echoed through the valleys, a steady heartbeat that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of war. The warriors, known as the Hippias, were the cream of Spartan society, chosen for their bravery, skill, and unwavering loyalty to their king. Among them were seasoned veterans, young hotheads eager for battle, and even a few Thespians and Thebans who had joined the Spartans in their quest to defend Greece against the Persian invaders. As they traversed the rugged terrain, the landscape unfolded like a canvas of stone and scrub. The warriors passed olive groves, their gnarled trunks twisted by the relentless Mediterranean sun, and villages that seemed to cling to the hillsides like ancient scars. The people they encountered, farmers and shepherds mostly, watched them with a mixture of awe and trepidation, knowing that these men were about to embark on a mission that would decide the fate of Greece. Leonidas rode at the head of the column, his broad shoulders squared, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He wore his trademark crimson cloak, the sagum, draped over his bronze cuirass, and his famous black hair flowed down his back like a river of night. As he marched, he was lost in thought, contemplating the oracle's words and the weight of responsibility that rested on his shoulders. The Spartans marched for hours, their pace steady, their spirits high. They sang war songs, their voices rising and falling in a cadence that seemed to stir the very earth beneath their feet. The song spoke of heroes, of Thermopylae's narrow pass, and of the glory that awaited those who stood against the Persian tide. As the sun began to set, casting the landscape in a warm, golden light, the Spartans reached the foot of the Kalidromos Mountains. Thermopylae lay ahead, a narrow defile between the mountains and the sea, where the hot gates waited like a gaping mouth to swallow armies whole. Here, the warriors would make their stand, Leonidas thought, his heart pounding with anticipation. Here, they would show Xerxes the meaning of Spartan courage. The march had been grueling, but the Spartans were not tired. They were focused, their minds fixed on the battle ahead. As they approached the hot gates, they could feel the weight of history settling on their shoulders, the knowledge that they were about to become part of something greater than themselves. As night began to fall, the Spartans made camp, their fires burning like stars in the darkness. They cleaned their armor, sharpened their swords, and made ready for the coming battle. Leonidas walked among them, his presence a reassuring force, his words a gentle reminder of what was at stake. "We will hold this pass," he told them, his voice low, his eyes burning with conviction. "We will not yield. We will not retreat. We will stand, and we will fight, and we will die, if need be, to keep Greece free." The Spartans nodded, their faces set, their hearts steeled for the battle ahead. They knew what was coming, and they were ready. The general smiled, their faces eager for battle. "These are Spartans, great king," they said. "They're the finest warriors in Greece, but they are few. We will crush them beneath our heel." Xerxes nodded, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. He had been told that the Spartans were formidable, but he had also heard that they were arrogant, that they thought themselves invincible. He would show them the true meaning of power. As the Persians advanced, their scouts reported that the Spartans had taken up position at the narrowest part of the pass, their phalanx formation bristling with spears, their shields overlapping like the scales of a dragon. Xerxes sneered. "They think to hide behind their walls of steel?" he asked. "We will show them the fury of Persia." The Persian army halted before the Spartans, their ranks forming a vast crescent, their banners snapping in the wind. Xerxes dismounted his chariot and approached the Spartans, his generals and immortals surrounding him like a golden tide. "Men of Sparta," he called out, his voice dripping with contempt, "I offer you a chance to surrender. Lay down your arms and acknowledge my rule, and you shall be spared. Resist, and you shall be." Leonidas, standing tall at the head of his phalanx, smiled grimly. "Come and take them," he said, his voice low, his eyes flashing with defiance. Xerxes' face darkened, his eyes narrowing. "You will regret those words, Spartan," he growled. "You will regret them for all eternity." As the Persians began to advance, their arrows and javelins arcing through the air, the Spartans braced themselves for the coming onslaught. The earth trembled beneath their feet, the air was heavy with the scent of war, and the hot gates waited, like a gaping mouth, to swallow armies whole. The Persian arrows rained down upon the Spartans like a deadly storm, their iron tips glinting in the sunlight as they arced through the air. But the Spartans stood firm, their shields overlapping like the scales of a dragon, their bronze armor glinting like gold as they braced themselves for the impact. The arrows clattered against the shields, their points biting deep into the wood, but the Spartans held fast, their phalanx formation unbroken. They were a wall of steel and bronze, a fortress of flesh and blood, and they would not be breached. As the arrows ceased, the Persian infantry charged forward, their wicker shields and scimitars no match for the Spartans' long spears and disciplined formation. The Greeks stood shoulder to shoulder, their spears thrusting out like a forest of steel, impaling the Persians as they came on. The Persians surged forward, wave after wave, but the Spartans held their ground, their spears and shields a deadly combination that cut down the enemy like wheat before the scythe. The hot gates were a killing ground, a narrow defile where the Persians were funneled into a killing zone, and the Spartans were the executioners. Leonidas stood at the center of the phalanx, his spear thrusting out like a serpent's tongue, striking down Persian after Persian. His voice boomed across the battlefield, urging his men on, exhorting them to stand firm and fight hard. The Persians began to waver, their ranks breaking as they realized that the Spartans were not to be intimidated. They had expected an easy victory, a quick and bloodless conquest, but instead they found themselves facing a foe who would not yield. Xerxes raged and stormed, his generals and immortals falling around him as he urged his troops forward. He could not believe that a handful of Spartans could hold out against his mighty army, and he began to suspect that they were being aided by the gods themselves. As the battle raged on, the Spartans began to tire, their arms heavy with the weight of their shields and spears, their bodies weary from the constant fighting. But they would not yield, they would not retreat, they would stand and fight to the death. And then, just as the Persians were about to launch a fresh assault, a lone figure emerged from the Greek ranks, a Spartan warrior who strode forward, his shield and spear at the ready. "Come and get me," he shouted, his voice echoing across the battlefield. "I'm ready for you." The Persians hesitated, taken aback by the warrior's bravery. And in that moment, the Spartans launched a counterattack, their spears thrusting out like a forest of steel, driving the Persians back, sending them reeling in confusion. The Spartans' phalanx formation was a wall of steel and bronze, a dense thicket of spears that seemed to stretch on forever. The Persians had faced similar formations before, but never one as formidable as this. The Spartans stood shoulder to shoulder, their shields overlapping, their spears thrusting out like a forest of steel. The phalanx was a masterpiece of ancient warfare, a tactical formation that had been perfected by the Spartans over centuries of battle. It was a shield wall, a spear hedge, a killing machine that could not be stopped. As the Persians charged forward, they were met with a bristling wall of spears, a thicket of points that seemed to impale them from all sides. The Spartans stood firm, their shields locked together, their spears thrusting out in a deadly rhythm. The Persians hacked and slashed at the Spartan shields, but the Greeks held firm, their armor and shields a formidable barrier against the enemy's blades. The Spartans, meanwhile, thrust and stabbed with their spears, striking down Persian after Persian. The phalanx formation was a masterpiece of discipline and training. Each Spartan warrior was a cog in a great machine, a part of a larger whole that could not be broken. They moved as one, they fought as one, they died as one. As the battle raged on, the Persians began to realize that they were facing something truly formidable. The Spartans were not just fighting for their lives, they were fighting for their honor, for their city, for their way of life. The phalanx formation seemed to be a living, breathing thing, a creature of steel and bronze that moved and flexed with the rhythm of battle. The Spartans were its heartbeat, its lifeblood, its very soul. And as the Persians faltered, as they began to fall back in disarray, the Spartans sensed victory within their grasp. They pushed forward, their spears thrusting out like a tidal wave of steel, driving the Persians back, sending them reeling in confusion. Xerxes raged and stormed, his generals and immortals falling around him as he urged his troops forward. But the Persians were no match for the Spartans' phalanx formation, and they began to waver, to falter, to fall back in disarray. The Spartans, meanwhile, stood tall, their shields and spears a formidable barrier against the enemy's blades. They were the masters of the battlefield, the lords of the hot gates, and they would not be defeated. As the sun began to set, casting the battlefield in a golden glow, the Persians began to retreat, to fall back in disarray. The Spartans stood victorious, their phalanx formation unbroken, their honor and their city secure. But the battle was far from over. The Persians would regroup, they would reform, and they would attack again. And the Spartans would face them, standing tall, their shields and spears at the ready, their hearts and souls unbroken. The Persians regrouped and reformed, their generals and immortals rallying them for a fresh assault. They attacked with renewed ferocity, their arrows and javelins raining down upon the Spartans like a deadly storm. But the Greeks stood firm, their phalanx formation unbroken, their shields and spears a formidable barrier against the enemy's blades. As the battle raged on, the Spartans began to tire, their arms heavy with the weight of their shields and spears, their bodies weary from the constant fighting. But they would not yield, they would not retreat, they would stand and fight to the death. And then, just as the Persians were about to launch a fresh assault, a traitor emerged from the shadows, a local resident named Ephialtes who had been bribed by the Persians to reveal a hidden path around the Spartan position. Ephialtes led the Persians along the secret path, a narrow and treacherous route that wound its way through the mountains, bypassing the Spartan phalanx and emerging behind the Greek lines. The Persians attacked, their immortals leading the charge, and the Spartans found themselves surrounded, their position compromised. Leonidas knew that the battle was turning against them, that the Persians had found a way to outflank them and attack them from behind. He called a council of his officers, a group of seasoned warriors who had fought alongside him for years. "We are surrounded," he told them, his voice low and urgent. "The Persians have found a way to outflank us, and we must act quickly to counter their move." The officers nodded, their faces grim and determined. They knew that the situation was dire, that the battle was turning against them. But they also knew that they were Spartans, that they were warriors, and that they would not yield. "We will fight to the death," one of them said, his voice firm and resolute. "We will not retreat. We will not surrender. We will stand and fight, and we will die if need be." Leonidas nodded, his eyes gleaming with pride and admiration. He knew that his men were brave, that they were willing to die for their city and their honor. And he was proud to lead them, proud to stand alongside them in the face of overwhelming odds. As the Persians closed in, the Spartans formed a circle, their shields and spears facing outwards, their hearts and souls unbroken. They were a tiny band of warriors, surrounded by a sea of enemies, but they would not yield. They would stand and fight, and they would die if need be, but they would not surrender. The battle raged on, the Persians attacking from all sides, the Spartans fighting with desperation and fury. The outcome was far from certain, but one thing was clear. The Spartans would not go down without a fight. As the Persians closed in, Leonidas stood tall, his spear thrusting out like a serpent's tongue, striking down enemy after enemy. He was a whirlwind of steel and bronze, a one-man army who seemed to be everywhere at once. The Spartans fought with desperation and fury, their shields and spears a formidable barrier against the enemy's blades. But they were vastly outnumbered, and the Persians were relentless in their attack. Leonidas knew that the situation was dire, that the battle was turning against them. But he also knew that he was a Spartan, that he was a warrior, and that he would not yield. He rallied his men, his voice booming across the battlefield, urging them to stand firm and fight hard. He led by example, charging forward, his spear thrusting out, striking down Persian after Persian. The Persians swarmed around him, their arrows and javelins raining down upon him like a deadly storm. But Leonidas stood firm, his shield and armor a formidable barrier against the enemy's blades that he fought with a ferocity that was unmatched, his spear and sword slicing through the Persian ranks like a hot knife through butter. He was a hero, a demigod, a warrior who seemed to be invincible. And then, just as the Persians were about to launch a fresh assault, Leonidas fell, his body pierced by a dozen arrows, his armor shattered, his spear broken. The Spartans rallied around him, their shields and spears forming a protective barrier, their hearts and souls unbroken. They fought with a desperation that was unmatched, their spears and swords slicing through the Persian ranks like a tidal wave of steel. But it was too late. Leonidas was dead, his body lifeless, his spirit departed. The Spartans fought on, their hearts filled with grief and rage, their souls burning with a desire for revenge. They fought with a ferocity that was unmatched, their spears and swords slicing through the Persian ranks like a hot knife through butter. But they were vastly outnumbered, and the Persians were relentless in their attack. The battle raged on, the Spartans fighting with desperation and fury, their shields and spears a formidable barrier against the enemy's blades. But they were doomed where they stood, surrounded by the enemy, their bodies weary, their spirits broken. The Persians closed in, their swords and spears slicing through the Spartan ranks, cutting them down like wheat before the scythe. The battle was over, the Spartans defeated, their heroism and bravery unmatched. But their legend lived on, their story told and retold, their bravery and sacrifice inspiring generations to come. They were the 300, the Spartans, the heroes of Thermopylae, and their name would be etched in history forever. The Persians had won the battle, but at great cost. They had lost thousands of men, and their immortals had been decimated. The Spartans, on the other hand, had fought to the death, and their bravery and sacrifice had inspired the other Greeks to continue the fight. As the Persians regrouped and reformed, they realized that the Spartans had given them a bloody nose. They had underestimated the Greeks, and they had paid the price. Xerxes, the great king, was furious. He had lost thousands of men, and his plans for conquest had been delayed. He knew that he had to regroup and reassess, to come up with a new plan to conquer Greece. The Persians began to retreat, their armies withdrawing from the battlefield, their banners and standards disappearing into the distance. The Greeks, on the other hand, were jubilant. They had held the pass, and they had given the Persians a bloody nose. The Spartans, despite their heavy losses, were hailed as heroes. They had fought to the death, and their bravery and sacrifice had inspired the other Greeks to continue the fight. The Battle of Thermopylae was a turning point in the war. The Persians had been checked, and the Greeks had been inspired. The war would go on, but the Persians would never again be as confident as they had been before. The story of the 300 Spartans would be told and retold, their bravery and sacrifice inspiring generations to come. They had fought to the death, and their legend would live on forever. The Persians, on the other hand, would never forget the lesson they had learned at Thermopylae. They had underestimated the Greeks, and they had paid the price. They would be more cautious in the future, and they would eventually be defeated. The Battle of Thermopylae was a testament to the bravery and sacrifice of the Spartans. They had fought to the death, and their legend would live on forever.